Hi, Eric. We are so happy to welcome you to the Sisterhood today.
Well, thanks for inviting a guy into it.
It's our pleasure. It's our
Yeah.
pleasure, but you're not the first Peterson to be a guest on the podcast. Elizabeth was a guest just this year, just during lockdown, right?
Yeah,
We were still
yeah.
kind of high in COVID when she came on. She was a gift to our listeners. So we need to remind everyone to go listen to that episode.
Mhm.
Yeah, I listened to it. I thought it was great.
Well, Eric, Elizabeth did share a little bit about your lives, but go ahead and tell everyone just who you are and what you do.
Yeah, so Elizabeth and we've been married for 10 years, just celebrated our 10th anniversary in August, and we each brought 3 kids to the marriage. So we refer to them as 3 bigs and 3 littles. Her littles are with us at the house. They're our twin 14-year-olds, co-ed twins, boy, girl, and a 12-year-old boy, and a dog named Samson. And I think I mentioned to you before you started the broadcast that for the last week, we've had a little 2-year-old who we refer to as the tiny. So we got the bigs, the littles, and the tiny. And until my parents passed, we referred to them as the elders.
Oh,
Those were the demographic categories. I identify as a village pastor. I serve a church that I founded in 1997, and I love being rooted in a place and being connected to people over long periods of time, sort of developmentally. I came here as a relatively young pastor, and I feel like it's a congregation, although the church itself and its composition has changed, considerably over these 24 years. But I feel like we've grown up together, and we've gone through some things together, and there's a deep bond. So I love being a pastor. I came to the realization some years ago that this is indeed what I was made for. And it's not easy work, but it feels meaningful. Deeply meaningful. Like this really is what I was made for. And I've just come to realize that meaningful and easy don't usually go together.
it's true.
So I'm okay with having good, hard, meaningful work to do.
Well, as you know, we are in a legacy series right now, and your legacy is a really interesting one because you are the son of Eugene Peterson, who also was a pastor. And so growing up, did you think I'm going to walk in my dad's shoes?
I remember when I was 11 or 12 years old, and somebody asked me that, a friend asked me that. And I remember sort of being horrified. Like, why would I want to do that? So I'll qualify this by saying that my dad has always been, from the time I have memory, this kind of hero, sort of larger than life. He was just the guy that put the moon in the sky at night. He just could do anything. And to this day, I have huge admiration for him. He's just always been my hero. And so I think the horror for me was not so much my understanding, limited as it was at that time, of the work, but just feeling like I could never do that. That's like having to be him and do what he does, and who could do that? So, but that really carried into young adulthood for me. I resisted what I now recognize as a call in my life for quite a few years. I went into carpentry, and I only went to seminary after that, really quite reluctantly, only because I felt called to go to seminary. I didn't feel called to be a pastor. And there was a point where I realized that to resist this call or invitation to seminary, to resist that anymore would be an act of outright disobedience. And I have enough fear of the Lord in me to not want to do that. So reluctantly, I went to seminary, and but all along the way, feeling like I'm just going to get the diploma, stick it in the file cabinet, and pull it out in 12 or 15 years when I'm actually mature enough to do this kind of work.
Yeah.
Because I don't know if you know this, but I'm now a fourth generation, and my son Drew is a fifth generation pastor. And so that's part of the legacy. It's like this is sort of in our genes. And in some ways, that's part of the reluctance, I think. I mean, it almost feels cliche. Like people could look at me and say, "Oh, you just went into the family business, didn't you? This is what Petersons do."
Yeah.
Anyway, I spent most of like 7/8 of my time in seminary just feeling like I'm just pushing my way through learning these stupid Hebrew words and church history dates and theology and all these things. And it was hard to stay motivated because I didn't really think about it in terms of this is what I'll be doing at the end of graduation. I was going to go back to carpentry. And then that call, that's a story in itself, but that became so clear, so compelling, and truly irresistible. It actually was a transforming moment where that image of pastor as something that I was running away from is something that literally overnight was transformed into this thing that was like a prize that I wanted to run toward. And so I, this was on a break. I was away from the seminary, and I went back to the campus, and I started trying to catch up and get ready and, line up interviews and things like that. And that led to a call to be an associate pastor, where I served for 7 years in the western side of the state. And I think I can count on one hand how many bad days I had. It was just a magnificent experience. And I learned a lot, grew a lot. And that was the equivalent for me. That 7 years in a parish was, I think, the equivalent of a Princeton education. I learned as much there as I did in seminary. And that's what prepared me ultimately to organize a new church outside of Spokane. Does that even come close to answering your question? I think I got lost where you were
No,
going.
I think it's fascinating because you are talking about these layers of legacy that go back generations. And that's, I think, for the average person who doesn't have that, it's an interesting detail, but it also stirs up this question in each of us: what is the thread of legacy in my family? And is it something that I want to keep going? Because I think we have legacies that are healthy and God honoring, and legacies that aren't. And so how do we, what are we continuing? What are we taking from the generation before us and putting into the generation that's coming behind us? So I think hearing anybody's story is fascinating, but to know that your dad was right there in the middle of those generations. If your son is fifth, then your dad was third, right? So he was in the middle. Tell us about him and how you knew him as your dad, and then as you became a pastor, as a person in your life that maybe guided you, or maybe not. I don't know.
Well, let me tell a story that's more recent, and then try to work my way back to answer your question. I mentioned to you earlier that I had been doing some field research, took a couple of field trips to 2 institutions that were interested in hosting the Peterson Center. This was after his death. And in the process of trying to figure out, how to discern that, I just called the directors of a handful of centers around the country and said, help me understand how this works, how they came to be, how are they funded? Just give me a crash tutorial on centers. And after this, the second trip, I remember being on an airplane, flying back to Spokane realizing, I was going through my notes, realizing all of these other centers are named after the, were founded, I should say, were founded by the people after whom they're named.
Wow.
Mm.
And then my realization was, oh, that never would have crossed Eugene's mind to start a center with his name on it. And if he did, he would have repented of it in the very next moment. So I think I just want you to know that by way of, he was just possessed of a deep humility, a genuine humility. He never got used to fame or notoriety or any kind of celebrity that tried to get imposed on him. He just shrugged that off. It never fit. And it's one of the reasons I think he receded back into Montana, where he could be out of that limelight. There was a point, gosh, I think it was after he retired for like the third time. And I was visiting him. We were over there at Flathead Lake, and he was just agonizing over a decision. He'd been asked to speak at one of those big arena events in South America somewhere. And he's just kind of hemming and hawing, like, I don't know if I should do this. And so I was just trying to ask him questions. And in my mind, I'm thinking, multiply your influence, get out there. And I finally said, Dad, what are you afraid of? Or what's the concern here? And this has haunted me ever since. He looked me right in the eye. He said, Eric, I'm afraid of losing my soul.
Wow.
And I said, well, I guess that's your answer. Your soul's worth more than whatever this is. So, but really at that point, that was a clarifying moment for him. And from that point on, with maybe one or two exceptions, he said no to all those big events. And only, he was pretty much just preaching at former students' ordination services and, teaching here and there, maybe giving a lecture. But he just realized that if he remained in that environment, being kind of exposed to that celebrity culture, that it would be his undoing. It was just too seductive. So he was a fierce guardian of his soul. And that's one of the things I think I've learned from him is that, especially as a pastor who is given the responsibility of the care and the cure of souls, I just think we need to recover a sense of the preciousness of our core identity and how easily it can be hijacked or sabotaged or damaged. There are a lot of hostile forces that would like to undo it, do harm to it. So, I remember it was probably within 2 years of his life, and we were noticing health declines in my parents. And so, I've been around a lot of death, and I've seen how the failure to plan can cause a real crisis for families. So I just called the family together for a couple of days and just said, how do you want this last stretch to go? And had a notebook of questions and just sort of went through those. And one of the questions was posed to my dad. I said, how do you want us to think about your legacy? And he said, until you asked that question, I've never even thought about that. And then the next day, we were shuffling around in the kitchen, getting breakfast together. And he said, I was thinking about that question that you asked yesterday about legacy. And I've got an answer. He said, you're my legacy. And at the moment, that felt like a heavy burden. Like, what do you mean? Am I supposed to write a whole bunch of books and translate the Bible again? And what does that mean to be your legacy? But I think as Alex kind of alluded to, this is it's a generational faith that we live. We have things that are passed down. And the way the scriptures talk about this is that the blessings and the curses both get handed down, from generation to generation. We can bless or curse. And so how we live, I think, is the legacy that we give, because it gets inherited. It gets caught,
absorbed.
Something, yeah, it gets integrated in some way, for good and for bad. So I received that. Again, being a generational pastor, I feel like, gosh, I'm an heir to vocational blessing. And there are things that I do and say that I sometimes afterwards think, where did that even come from? I didn't know that. No one taught me that. But there's something in there that keeps getting passed on. Something's working in me. And it's a mystery to me, but I think it has something to do with this notion of legacy, spiritual legacy. Yeah.
Wow. I got teary several times as you were talking, because to sit under that kind of humility and that kind of gentleness and that kind of person, ooh, you may have to take over, Alex.
Yeah, it's pretty powerful. And I didn't say this to you, Eric, before we recorded, because I wanted to say it so our listeners could hear. But Elizabeth knows this, that Eugene I was moved to tears when the family made the announcement that he was probably going into his last stretch of days and weeks. And what struck me in that was he was so rare for today's world. Now, I don't know. I can romanticize that maybe people had that kind of humility and spiritual wisdom in generations past, but I don't know. That's kind of maybe romanticizing the past. But for today, as a person who's living today, looking for someone who is living well, he was a person that, despite his efforts to be in the shadows or to not be in the limelight, he still was brought to our attention. God allowed us to get glimpses of that humble spirit as just kind of everyday Christians in the United States right now, trying to figure out how to live a faithful life. He and your mom too, I feel like, in connection to him, were such a model for us. But not only that, he personally gave me such a gift in the message, because I was a young person who didn't grow up in a Christian family. And the Bible still feels weird to me. It still feels awkward. And I don't quite know, do I know all the right stories? Do I know them in the right order? And when I read the message with a more traditional translation, it helps my heartbeat understand the intent of God's word. And so for me, it was a personal thing, because Eugene Peterson, as the person who gifted us with the message paraphrase, and then also just as a person looking for people to, because it isn't in my family legacy, but people to live under. I considered him one of the few living spiritual fathers in my life. And so I think he just had this real unique way of being incredible without putting himself in the forefront. So I don't want to make him out to be more than a man, because I know he was a human like the rest of us. And yet at the same time, he had a certain spirit about him that I think was so notable that it was noteworthy and the world took note. And so we we are grateful that you're willing to talk about him, because I think a lot of people share our sentiment.
Yeah. Well, I think that's all right. I would agree with all that. And I would just add that it was, what he became or how he became known was not something that he pursued. That was not his, he didn't wake up one day saying, I'm going to go do this thing. He spent 29 years in obscurity, in a little town, small church. And he was writing some books and did a bit of, traveling and speaking, but it was only with the publication of the message that he really, became known, internationally. And that's probably a good thing for an ego. I think most of us in our younger years can't handle that kind of notoriety without it going to our heads and that, causing all kinds of problems. I remember, I think our third child had just been born, and my parents had come down from Vancouver, British Columbia, where he was teaching, to spend some time with us, meet Sadie, and the TV was on, and there was a Billy Graham crusade. It was one of those satellite things, it was broadcast all over the world. So I don't know how many millions of people were watching the broadcast, but it was massive. It was just a global crusade. And then there's this commercial break where Billy comes on, pre-recorded thing, and said, call for prayer, and Billy Graham, and here's the zip code, and we'll send you a copy of, and then it puts up on the screen a copy of the message, and it says Eugene H. Peterson. And I'm sitting on the sofa next to my dad, and kind of doing this thing, and he's just sort of staring straight ahead, and I think neither one of us kind of were like, holy smokes. And we got in the car about 15 minutes later to run an errand together, and I said, what was that like for you? Billy Graham, millions and tens of millions, and he said, it's like they're talking about somebody else. And again, he just never, right up to the end of his life, he never fully absorbed that, took that on. He could have identified in a lot of ways, but his preferred, at least vocational identity, was always pastor. That's who he was. And so all the work that he did, all the words that he cobbled together in 35 plus books came out of that environment. It, for him, was just this incredibly fertile environment for where the Spirit works. And so he just, everything he wrote got worked out of a congregational context. Some of that fruit just didn't ripen until after he left the church, or I should say left his parish.
What's so interesting is that Billy Graham's granddaughter is on this same series.
Ah, good.
Isn't that so? That's just a really fun little connection right there. That just delights me. Eric, it's so inspiring to hear you talk. And I'm thinking about this idea of spiritual legacy. And as we just talked about, like how profoundly impactful it is to live under someone who models that kind of humility and that kind of strength, but rooted in the right place, right? Like kind of this unshakable strength because they're rooted well. And I think about spiritual legacy and how it's passed on and what that looks like. And I feel like you're hitting it in these different ways as we've gone through the interview, but can you just speak a little bit to that, as well as you are not only now parenting and grandparenting, but you're also shepherding your church? And just what does that kind of look like from looking back to looking forward?
Yeah, I think I would start by just saying there was a steadiness about him, a firm foundation, all those things, but it also shook. It teetered. he was as human and flawed as the rest of us. And I just think it's important that we don't, create hagiographies around people that we admire. I refer to him kind of playfully, but seriously as Saint Eugene. Let's like in a Bible study, we'll be reading the text. Well, let's let Saint Eugene, speak in here and see what he has to say. And that's a real thing. That's meaningful. But after his death, having access to his journals, you kind of get inside the doubts and the fears and the struggles, temptations, the regrets that I hadn't previously been aware of. There was nothing in there that surprised me or shocked me or I found scandalous. It was actually kind of refreshing, like, oh, he really, I struggle with that too. I'm so glad to know that he did. He just didn't burden his son with that. That's what you have friends and therapists for. I want to just say that. I want to say he was a giant of a man, but he was a man. He was human. I think in terms of spiritual legacy, it feels a little, I should say largely mysterious to me. I don't know that this is something that can be well-defined, controlled, or even predicted, because these gifts, if we're talking about a spiritual legacy, the gifts that we stand to inherit or receive can either be picked up or left behind. And that's one of the mysteries to me. Why is it that some people don't pick it up? In my case, the grace was given to me to pick it up. It's not exactly Elisha picking up Elijah's mantle, but it has a bit of a feel to that. I feel like I've been given a portion of the spirit of Eugene, and I hear him in my voice when I'm preaching sometimes and at hospital bedsides. And I have sort of become the family's de facto spokesperson. When someone wants to, this is the conference I mentioned to you, I'm speaking for him. I'm speaking for myself too, but there's some things that I'm going to say that represent him, because he can no longer say what I think he would want to say. So I don't know, that doesn't feel like a really good answer to your question, except that I just feel like there's some mystery to it. For example, I got a call from a former parishioner last week, and she called me up. So this was my previous church, 300 miles away. Haven't seen her for 28 years. And she called me up and said, I just wanted you to know that something you said to me back in 1992 happened, or the way you said that was meaningful, and it played out in this way, this redemptive way. The details aren't important. And then, so afterwards, I just thought, oh my gosh, I barely remember the person. I certainly don't remember anything I said.
Yeah.
But that was a potent reminder for me that really we're just planting little seeds. We are just taking little steps of faithfulness, trying to do our best, showing up, being faithful, dignifying people, trying to stay rooted, in the tradition and the scriptures, and people of prayer. And sometimes you get immediate feedback, like someone comes out and says, that's the most profound sermon I've ever heard in my life. But more often you don't hear anything. And or it takes 27 years before there's any kind of realization that, oh, that even as a young pastor, I helped this woman who was traumatized by sexual abuse when she was 13 years old. She had to remind me what that was. That was the situation. So I think that's part of the kind of the long haul nature of legacy. It's it's a protracted kind of experience that that occurs over long periods of time and sometimes generations, and sometimes it doesn't bear fruit for generations. It'll skip some. But I think that there's something about our faithfulness that God honors and blesses eventually, ultimately, even if we don't, see it. So those little stories along the way, little testimonies, that's kind of what keeps me going, just to keep doing the quiet, faithful, humble work that I feel like I've been called to do, and trusting that the Spirit blesses that and makes a redemptive difference. That's, I mentioned the Peterson Center, and there's something of legacy there, but it's not about Eugene so much. It's not about him. It's got his name on it, but it's really only because he found a unique way to live in this world that many of us have found to be compelling and refreshing, and sane in a kind of a crazy world and a crazy church, which has adopted so many values and practices of business. And it's not sustainable, and it's just a bad ecclesiology. I mean, we just have some bad, we have bad ecclesiology, largely in North America. And Eugene, I think, helped a lot of pastors to find a faithful, healthy way to do this work. And so the Peterson Center is really just about continuing and integrating some of those practicalities. And so there are students who are writing doctoral dissertations based on his stuff. They're just carrying it on. They're like, here's the next step. Here's the next way that this plays out. But it's not him. It's what he was about. He was just an agent of the gospel. He was always pointing beyond himself to the reality of the saving work of Christ in the world. And again, I think that's why he was just so uneasy with the attention given to him, because he knew it wasn't about him. But we all like heroes, we all like celebrities, and he just kept shrugging that off. So I would say that's part of his legacy. He didn't put his name. Well, he put his name on some things, but yeah.
Mm-hmm.
But it wasn't about him.
Mm-hmm. I think that's really encouraging to our listeners, because this idea of planting seeds that you may never see sprout doesn't mean they're not going to sprout at some point. And it helps as, our listeners are mostly women, as women are seeing their kids grow up and become young adults and maybe make decisions that make moms nervous, and moms are praying these midnight prayers for their kids. But to know that the seeds that we plant are there, and when they sprout and how they sprout may be based on the Holy Spirit's intervention. But that to leave a legacy doesn't mean we're going to see the results right away. It might be more likely that we won't, that we may have the benefit and the joy of seeing part of it at some point in our lifetime, but to maybe change that expectation of, I'm going to see this now and I'm going to see it play out now, and so that's going to make me feel better right now. Yeah. Because I think as parents, and we're thinking about our kids leaving, that's when we start to think about what kind of legacy are they taking with them as they leave home. We get nervous. Did we do enough? Did we do it the right way? And for you to say there's some mystery here, and there's also some choice in a gift, if someone's going to pick it up or leave it, that's freedom giving to parents to say, okay, I did my part, and I'm going to believe that they're carrying those seeds with them out into the world. If they're not picking up the gifts right now, they are taking some of it with them, and where it sprouts and when, maybe in my lifetime and maybe not.
Yeah. Well, and I also want to build in room for failure. Not all the seeds germinate or bear good fruit. The parable of the sower, shows this recklessness of the word of God being spread just kind of, pell-mell. There's no care. It's wasteful, and it's not even wise, which I think reflects just the generosity and the extravagance of the gospel, the kingdom, the nature of God. But there's failure. Not all the seed does what it was designed to do. So I think we also need to say, we're planting seeds. We don't know what we're doing. And not everything is going to bear fruit. Not everything's going to play out the way we hope it does. And that's not an indictment. That doesn't mean that we're a failure. It just means that not everything goes according to plan. We live in a world where there is opposition to goodness, and there's hostility to the kingdom, and there's resistance. And I just think we need to have a better theology of failure, to build that into our expectations of, okay, that didn't work. I did my best. I might do it differently next time, but I'm going to trust that there's a redeemer in this world that can take all the failures and the broken pieces and make something beautiful out of it.
Just appreciate that so much. And I think those are just words of life to people, because I don't know one of us who doesn't have broken pieces that we're holding. And so that just brings so much hope, and that it doesn't sideline us when it comes to this idea of legacy, that actually
Right.
It's just faithfulness. It's not results, it's faithfulness.
I think that's exactly right. That's really well said.
So Eric, as we are closing this interview, which I'm very sad about, because I just want to talk to you all day. Truly, like, I just have felt so moved several times by what you were saying in this interview. But what one piece of advice might you give parents in regards to legacy? If you're just thinking about, here's just something that I've learned over my many years of doing the work that I do, both in family and in your church, and being a recipient of really, really beautiful, amazing parents. What's something you would say to them?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I have thought about it quite a bit, because I sit with a lot of people who are getting ready to bury their parents, and they tell stories, and so I get to hear what was meaningful and what was harmful and hurtful and disappointing. And this is my own experience too. My dad worked way too hard when I was a kid. And I think the only reason that I'm somewhat sane is because of the stability of my mother. She was just there, always present, taking care of us. She was just the steady, present one. And so actually my dad and I had some work to do. When I was a young adult, again, long story, you don't need to hear all the details, but I spent some time in therapy just trying to understand what this was, kind of the father wound, the kind of the lack of his attentiveness to me at some formative points in my life. And then we had to have a hard conversation. And he was extraordinarily gracious, receptive, and non-defensive. He just heard it, welcomed it, received it, was saddened by it. He wept and was so contrite and sorry, and saying things like, I didn't realize I did exactly what my dad did. I just worked. I thought that's how I loved my family, just that kind of thing. That was his model. But that was the turning point for us. That is to say, that's when our relationship really changed and began to flourish and was characterized by mutuality, to the point where a couple of years later, we were in a car together traveling, and I said, "Hey, Dad, I'm just curious about this. I've got some really good friends. Who's your best friend?" And he said, "You are." And I don't know if I said it out loud, but I thought to myself, "Oh, crap, is that the best you can do?" And then it felt like this burden, like, "Oh man, I've got to be your best friend." Like, what does that even mean? So I guess so that experience, I mean, all that experience combined for me as a young dad helped to raise to a level of consciousness this determination to not do that again, to be something of a pattern breaker of a generation of Peterson men that were workaholics, did good work, took care of their families, but it left some of the people in the families feeling emotionally deprived. There was a deprivation that resulted. And I'm sure I've done it, poorly, but I've tried to do it differently. And I just always wanted my kids to never have any question or doubt that they were the most important thing to me, and that I would choose them over work anytime. So, I mean, I think that's sort of the heart of what I'm trying to get to, is just to say it's these relationships that are most important. This is where we get formed. And I've just, I hear people at memorial services talking about what people have done and accomplished, but that's not really what they're emphasizing. They're talking about the relationship, who they were as a person in relationship to them. So that's what I guess I would hope for and encourage people to take seriously, is the people right before you, whoever they are, whenever that is. That's the most important thing right now.
Well, that is gold to end on. And I think it's so real. I mean, for you to just acknowledge that piece of, our relationship was strained for this reason. It didn't mean it was a bad relationship. We just had something we had to work out.
That's right.
And that is just so real, because all of us have that in our primary relationships of, there's just something we need to work out. But I think the hope in it is that, again, back to that humility, with that contrite spirit, healing happens and we can move forward.
Yeah.
Amen to that. Well, Eric, thank you so much for being with us today. It has really, really been special. Thank you.
I'm very glad it was meaningful to you. It was nice to be with you too.
All right. Have a great day.
Thanks. You too.
Bye.